When there's something tough in front of us, we start to act differently, right? Think about it. We start to engage with the things that are most important to us. Take this, for example, if you have a really difficult test or a hard quiz coming up, you start to change your behavior. You change your schedule so that you can fit in time to study the material so that you can get a good grade. Some of us, for another example, are experiencing this right now. We know that this coronavirus thing might last just a little bit longer than we're hoping, and so we're starting to spend more time engaging with our family. We're reaching out to our friends and our loved ones because they're important to us, and we know that through this difficulty, going to the things that are important to us are going to help. It's going to feel better. It's more important in those times, it feels like. And we get the exact sense of this behavior in Jesus on the Thursday before Easter. You see, we know that Jesus knew that the next day he would go through some really difficult stuff. He would be tried and condemned and hung up on a cross. And he knew what that meant for his disciples, how painful that would be. And so we see him starting to cling to the things that are most important to him. And this is crucial for us to remember because we know that Jesus is fully human, but he's also fully God. And so the things that are important to him are important to God. And if we want to live a life after him, we need to make the things that are important to God important to us. And so this story is all about what is important to Jesus. Let's take a look at what happens. We join the disciples at a dinner party that Jesus is throwing for them. They're celebrating the Passover, which is a Jewish holiday, and this dinner party was held in an upper room. It was a small room with all of them in their friends, hanging out, sharing stories, laughing together, loving one another. Jesus believed in the power of community, so he brought all his people together, and this was probably seemed like a normal dinner celebration for the disciples. They had done this a few times before and they understood it, but there were a few things that were different about this night. One of the ones was the way that Jesus washed his disciples' feet when they started eating, which would have only been done by a servant, not a rabbi. And so they were kind of thrown off by that level of humility and love for them from Jesus. But then later on in the meal, Jesus quiets everybody down and he takes the communal bread in his hands. And you see the bread at this time, it didn't look like this. It wasn't sliced perfectly, but it was flat, and they would use it to mop up all of the other food and use it more like a fork or a knife to bring it and be able to eat it. And so Jesus that night, he took the bread and he showed it to all his disciples. Yes, they saw that this was the communal bread that they would all pull from. And he said, "This bread is my body, broken for you." And he broke it right in front of them. And in that same exact way, he took the communal cup of wine from which all of them would pour out into their own cups. And he said, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood poured out for you." And he took both of them in his hand and he said, "Anytime that you eat of this bread, anytime that you drink of this cup," basically saying anytime that you are engaged in community with the people around you, because these things were so important to every dinner gathering. He says, anytime you do this, do it in remembrance of me. Do it in remembrance of me breaking my body, pouring out my blood because I love you. Because I love you. And so today we celebrate communion all over the world as a chance to remember that life-changing love of who Jesus Christ is. And we do it in the context of community because God believes in the body of believers. The Holy Spirit is coursing through all of us when we are together and we are able to experience Him in amazing ways through community and loving one another. And so we remember on this day to focus on the love that God has for us and the love that He wants us to have for community. take a few moments to reflect on this question before we continue on the story of the Thursday before Easter. Well, after that meal where Jesus leans into love and leans into community, we see another thing that Jesus is focusing on, another thing that's important to him in the scene at the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus goes out to be by himself with God in this beautiful garden, alone in nature with God. Jesus starts to pray honestly to him. Jesus begins his prayer by basically saying, God, I know what it is I have to do, but Lord, I am stressed by this. I'm anxious about this. God, if there was any other way, if it be your will, would you take this cup from my hands? He says. And in this, we get a sense of just this amazing, honest, vulnerable prayer of Jesus. And the example that we get from this is that we can be open with our God. God understands the things that we're going through, and he wants us to be honest and open with him. He wants us to share the things that we're going through. And when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he was sweating blood because he was so stressed and nervous about what he had to do that very next day, he was open and honest with God. And so we see that vulnerability in that prayer. And then later on, he opens his prayer with that, if there's any other way. But then he closes the prayer by just this amazing sense of trust in the will of the Father. Jesus says this, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." Not my will, not the things that bring me comfort, not me getting out of something that I'm being called to because I'm nervous about it, but instead, God, may your will be done in my life. May my life be about you. There is an amazing power in that balance in the example of prayer that Jesus gives for us in the Garden of Gethsemane, being fully honest and open and vulnerable with God, sharing with him our emotions, but then also holding on to this beautiful trust and faith that God's will is powerful. And that when we are called to something by God and we can follow that will, he is going to strengthen us, encourage us, comfort us, and empower us through that. So friends, what does this mean for us? Well, it means that we need to be focusing in on love in our community, to love one another, love the people around us. And it also means that we need to spend time with God, to be honest and open and vulnerable, and to be trusting in his will. These are the two things that Jesus clung to on that Thursday before Easter. Those are the things that are important to him, to love one another and to love God. And so let's go and do the same thing, loving each other and loving God.